Backing her cousin's flatbed to the dock, Sarah Kessler took the bruised, rejected apples everyone else charged to haul away. Free. 10,000 pounds of rot piled behind her grandfather's mill. Neighbors called her crazy. She said nothing, sorting the best into tart apple shrubs, a drinking vinegar perfected after losing her restaurant job. 90 days later, 3 production runs sold out online. A distributor picked up her line and receipts hit 6 figures. All from fruit growers had already thrown away. Sarah Kessler was a laid-off restaurant cook with no equipment, no business plan, and a growing mountain of rotting apples that had her entire hometown convinced she'd lost her mind. She was about to turn 10,000 pounds of trash into a 6-figure drinking vinegar empire in 90 days. But before a single bottle sold, she had to survive 46 straight batches that failed so badly she nearly walked away for good. Sarah Kessler lost her restaurant job on a Tuesday, and by Saturday she was living in her grandfather's abandoned cider mill with no heat, no income, and a single hot plate. The mill had been shuttered for 8 years, its press rusted solid, its rafters packed with old swallow nests. She wasn't hiding. She was hunting. 3 miles down the valley, a commercial orchard called Ridgecrest was discarding 6,000 pounds of apples every single week during harvest. Bruised drops, hail-scarred fruit, apples that had softened just enough for a grocery buyer to reject the entire pallet. The orchard paid a composting facility to haul them away. Sarah watched the trucks roll out for 2 weeks and did the math. She then walked into the packing house, found the foreman, and told him she'd take every single reject, free of charge, starting the next morning. He stared at her like she'd asked to buy air. Within days, the rumor shot through town. The Kessler girl was piling up a mountain of rot behind her grandfather's mill. The smell carried. Neighbors slowed their pickups to gawk. At the hardware store, a man who'd known her since she was a kid called it a health code violation waiting to happen. Sarah said nothing. She just kept hauling the fruit, hand-sorting through the bruised pile every morning, pulling out the apples that were still firm enough to work with. Those she hauled inside the mill, where she ran them through a hand-cranked grinder salvaged from the barn. The rest she let the deer and the compost take. What nobody in town understood was that Sarah had spent the previous year perfecting a recipe. After her restaurant closed, she'd started making apple shrubs in her apartment kitchen. A colonial-era drinking vinegar that blends mashed fruit, raw sugar, and live vinegar into a tart, herbal syrup that bartenders mix into cocktails and chefs drizzle on roasted pork. It was an old technique that barely anyone bothered with commercially because it required weeks of cold maceration, precise ratios, and a palate sharp enough to balance sweet against acid in a constantly shifting raw product. Sarah had gotten good at it. She just hadn't tried it at scale, and she'd never worked with fruit this inconsistent. The mill had no climate control. Night temperatures dropped below freezing inside the stone walls. Her first batch of shrubs seeped off flavors from fruit that had turned faster than she expected. Batch 2 grew a film of wild mold because she'd misjudged the sugar concentration. Batch 5 separated into 3 layers of sludge. She threw them all out. She maxed out the credit card she'd kept for emergencies just to buy raw sugar and clean barrels. When batch 12 failed, she sat on the mill floor for an hour and genuinely considered walking back into town to beg for her old line cook job. But she kept a notebook. Every failed batch got a page. Apple varieties, ambient temperature, maceration time, vinegar pH, tasting notes. 46 batches went into that notebook. 46 failures. She learned which heritage apple varieties, pulled from the oldest trees on the Ridgecrest property, held their structure long enough to macerate cleanly. She learned that a slow, cold infusion of rosemary and thyme, done in the final 2 days, masked the bitterness that ruined her earlier attempts. And on the 47th attempt, she lifted the lid of a 5-gallon food-grade bucket and caught a smell she hadn't earned yet. Something bright, tart, and unmistakably intentional. She dipped a spoon. The shrub was sharp and deeply apple-forward with an herbal undertone that lengthened the finish instead of souring it. She swallowed, set the spoon down, and wrote one word in the notebook. Yes. She had enough left in her bank account for 1 more week. She needed just one person with influence to believe in what she'd made. She had no idea that person was about to call. The call came at 7:40 in the morning. A chef named Marcus Vane from a farm-to-table restaurant called Thistle in the next town over. He tasted a jar of her shrub that a neighbor passed along after she'd gifted a few test bottles. He said two things. The Rosemary Thyme batch was one of the best cocktail mixers he'd ever sampled, and he wanted a case for his bar program by Friday. Sarah looked at the single 5-gallon bucket sitting on the mill bench. She had about 48 ounces finished. She told him yes without hesitating. Friday was 4 days away. She did not sleep more than 3 hours across any of those nights. She crushed apples by hand, macerated fruit in every clean container she could find, and sacrificed her last bag of raw sugar. The vinegar mother she had carefully kept alive since batch 12 went into 3 simultaneous ferments. By Thursday evening, she had bottled exactly 12 glass flasks, each labeled with a strip of masking tape and the words Mill House Shrub written in marker. The delivery went out on time. Marcus paid cash. Within a week, the restaurant had burned through the entire case. Marcus called again, this time to place a standing weekly order. But here's the thing. Sarah's supply chain depended entirely on whatever bruised apples the Ridgecrest foreman decided to dump on any given Tuesday. She had no guarantee of fruit, no consistent varieties, and no leverage to ask for either. So she walked back into the packing house, sat down with the foreman, a man named Don Quejo who still thought she was running a public nuisance, and showed him the cash receipts. Don stared at the numbers. Then he looked up at the young woman who, 2 months earlier, had been the town joke. He agreed to set aside specific heirloom varieties for her, fruit from the oldest blocks on the orchard at no cost, if she promised to move at least 2,000 pounds a week. That was more than she could process alone. She said yes anyway. This was the moment everything pivoted. Sarah had entered this arrangement as a woman salvaging trash. She was now leaving it as a supplier negotiating for specific raw material from a commercial orchard that was actively interested in her success. The mountain of rot behind the mill stopped being a liability and started being inventory. She registered the business name officially, Mill House Provisions. She secured her food processing license after a tense inspection that she passed only because she documented every failed batch in obsessive detail and could prove she knew exactly what contamination looked like. She built a simple website. A farm shop in Rhinebeck picked up a few bottles. Then a specialty grocer in Hudson placed a shelf order. Then a distributor who supplied cocktail bars across the Northeast found her at a small food festival, tasted the shrub mixed with bourbon, and asked a question that changed everything. How many cases can you give me next month? Sarah didn't know the answer. She'd been filling orders bucket by bucket, using the same hand-cranked grinder she'd salvaged when she moved in. The distributor wanted volume she couldn't produce without equipment she couldn't afford and help she couldn't pay for. And that's when the same town that had called her crazy started showing up differently. The neighbor who had snapped photos of the rotting pile pulled into her drive one afternoon with a portable steam cleaning unit and offered to sanitize her barrels for $20 and lunch. The man from the hardware store, the one who called her operation a public nuisance, turned out to have a nephew who welded stainless steel and could fabricate a custom maceration tank for half the price of a commercial unit. The orchard hand Don Quejo sent over to help her sort fruit told her privately that half the guys at Ridgecrest had been taking bets on how long she'd last, and every single one of them had lost. Sarah took every offer. She didn't have the luxury of pride. She had a dead grandfather's mill, 47 failed batches behind her, and a distributor who had just asked for more product than she'd ever made in a single month. She cobbled together enough equipment to triple her output. She hired the orchard hand part-time to manage the crushing and straining, and for the first time since the first truckload backed up to the dock, she looked at her numbers and realized she was about to cross into something she had never even let herself imagine. 90 days. From the first delivery of rejected fruit to a signed distribution contract and an online store that had sold through 3 full production runs. 6 figures in receipts. Every dollar traced back to Apple's growers had already written off as worthless. But here is what nobody saw coming. Just as the money started clearing, just as the distributor was prepping a regional launch that would put Millhouse Shrub on shelves in 3 states, the orchard called with news that nearly killed the business on the spot. The call came from Don Quejo himself. He didn't waste any time on pleasantries. A major juice conglomerate had approached Ridgecrest with an offer to buy their entire reject stream at a per-pound rate that made composting look like a charity. Starting next week, Sarah's free apples would stop. If she wanted to keep receiving fruit, she'd have to match the offer, and the conglomerate was paying commodity pricing that her fledgling business couldn't touch. He was sorry, but business was business. The call ended before she could respond. For 3 hours, Sarah sat in the cold mill and stared at the distributor's purchase order pinned to the wall. She had 48 hours of raw fruit left, 12 standing orders from restaurants, 2 specialty grocers, and a distributor who expected a full pallet in 10 days. If her supply disappeared, she couldn't just pause production. She'd breach contracts she had spent months building. The brand would be dead before it turned a year old. Her first move was desperation. She called every orchard within 100 miles. Half of them had never heard of apple shrubs. The other half asked why they'd sell her fruit at a discount when the juice plant down County Road would pay market rate for the exact same rejects. One grower laughed and told her to try making wine instead. By sundown, she had one orchard willing to sell her a small weekly volume at a price that would erase her margins entirely. It was a tourniquet, not a solution. Then, on a Tuesday morning, she pushed open the door of Ridgecrest's main office and asked to speak not with Don, but with the family that owned the orchard, the Harpers. They had run Ridgecrest for 3 generations, and they prided themselves on a reputation that extended well beyond the packing house. She didn't plead for free fruit. She didn't complain about Don. She placed a bottle of the rosemary thyme shrub on the conference table and told them exactly what it was made from. Their own heirloom golden russets and Roxbury russets, the oldest trees on the property, the fruit that every juice buyer treated as filler. She had turned it into a product that sat on shelves next to imported balsamic vinegar. Then she made her offer. She would pay a modest per-pound fee for the apples, not commodity pricing but cash in hand, and in return the Harper family name would sit on every bottle. Ridgecrest Heirloom Reserve. Their orchard, their story, their fruit, credited on the label of a premium product sold in cocktail bars and farm-to-table restaurants across 3 states. She wasn't asking for charity. She was offering a partnership that the juice conglomerate could never replicate. You can't build a brand story around anonymous pulp that gets pasteurized into concentrate. You can build one around a small batch shrub made from apples nobody else wanted. The Harpers looked at the bottle, then at her. Then at each other. Margaret Harper, the matriarch who still managed the orchard's books, asked only one question. "How long have you been working without a paycheck?" Sarah answered honestly. "Since I moved in." Margaret nodded. She told Don to cancel the juice deal and draw up a new agreement with Sarah directly. Not only would Ridgecrest supply her fruit at a token rate, they would set aside the best of the rejects, the hail-marked but still firm fruit, the bruise-free drops, the varieties with the most aroma, exclusively for Millhouse Provisions. Within 2 weeks, Sarah went from a dead supply chain to a preferential supplier relationship that guaranteed better raw material than she had ever received for free. That story should have ended with a handshake and a sigh of relief. It didn't. Because the moment the supply crisis resolved, the regional distributor, the one who had asked for a full pallet, called with a new problem. A national vinegar brand had taken notice of Millhouse Shrub's shelf placement and filed a trademark objection, claiming the word shrub was being used in a way that confused consumers about the product's origin. The objection was flimsy. Shrub is a generic term for drinking vinegar dating back to the colonial era. But the national brand had lawyers on retainer, and Sarah had exactly none. The distributor put her order on hold pending legal review. Her biggest account, frozen overnight. She had less than a week of operating cash. Her part-time orchard hand needed a paycheck. The new maceration tank was half fabricated, and the welder was waiting on a materials deposit she no longer had. For the second time in a month, Sarah Kessler stood on the edge of losing everything she had built on a mountain of rotten apples. But she had not survived 46 failed batches by quitting when things looked impossible. She called the one person who had believed in her before anyone else, Marcus Vane, the chef at Thistle. She told him what was happening, and what Marcus did next didn't just save the company. It completely changed who was paying attention. Marcus Vane didn't just call his lawyer. He called 6 other chefs. Then he called a food writer at a regional magazine who had featured Thistle in a spread the previous fall. Then he posted a single photo to his restaurant's social media, a bottle of Millhouse Shrub next to a perfectly balanced cocktail, with a caption that read simply, "Made from apples nobody wanted. Tastes like exactly what we needed." Within 12 hours, the trademark objection became a story. The food writer ran a piece titled "The Colonial Drink a multi-million-dollar brand wants to own." It opened with Sarah standing in her grandfather's unheated mill, surrounded by barrels, explaining the historical meaning of the word shrub, a term older than the United States itself, brought over by English settlers who preserved fruit in vinegar and sugar. The article pointed out that the national brand's own website traced its origins to the same tradition. The irony was hard to miss. By the time the piece hit social media, the brand's objection looked less like a legal strategy and more like a public relations trap. Comments piled up. Home bartenders, history buffs, and small batch makers all weighed in. Nobody wanted to see a generic term trademarked out from under a young woman who had literally salvaged her product from a compost pile. The national brand withdrew its objection before the end of the week. A mid-level legal representative sent a short note claiming the filing was routine and that they wished Millhouse Provisions continued success. The distributor unsuspended the order the same day, and suddenly every restaurant that had been waiting on the sidelines decided they needed their own case before the next press hit ran out of steam. Sarah was still standing in the same mill, still working the same barrels, but the ground underneath her had completely shifted. Orders came in faster than she could log them. The orchard hand she'd hired part-time went full-time, and they added a second employee to handle the flood of online sales. The website crashed twice in a single afternoon. A national beverage publication called her one of 10 women reshaping American craft food. She read the headline on her phone, set it down, and then pressed both palms flat against the old cider press that had nearly defeated her a year earlier. She didn't cry. She said she just stood there breathing for a long time. The numbers that started coming through were the kind she'd never dared to write down in that spiral notebook. First month of scaled production, $17,000. Second month, $41,000. By the close of the first quarter after the article, she had pushed past $200,000 in total revenue since the day the first truckload of rejects had rolled up. The distributor expanded into 2 new states. A national gift catalog picked up a sampler trio, and a chef in Chicago, who had never been within 300 miles of Sarah's orchard, called to place a standing order for a private label shrub made exclusively from the Ridgecrest heirloom fruit. The partnership with the Harpers deepened. Margaret Harper started meeting Sarah for coffee every other Thursday, and the conversations shifted from pounds of fruit to long-term plans. They were talking about planting new blocks of heritage varieties specifically for Millhouse, trees that would take years to bear, but would yield exactly the aromatic, high-acid apple Sarah needed. It was the first time anyone in the valley had planted an orchard in decades with a single customer in mind, and it meant more to Sarah than any revenue figure she could name. The one final detail nobody saw coming was this. The neighbor who had pulled over his truck to photograph the piles of rot, the one who had asked county officials if the smell could be stopped, showed up at the mill one Saturday morning carrying a jar of his grandmother's pickled beets and an offer. He wanted to invest, not a huge sum, but enough to help her buy a proper commercial pasteurizer that would let her break into the retail grocery market without needing a co-packer. He told her he'd been wrong about the whole thing. He'd watched the local economy lose jobs for years, and he had never imagined the answer would come from someone who looked at a dump pile and saw a business. Sarah sold him a small share of the company. Margaret Harper notarized the paperwork. By the time the first snow fell that winter, Sarah Kessler was standing in a fully equipped production space that had once been her grandfather's hayloft, running a company with 4 employees, a 6-state distribution footprint, and accounts with 23 restaurants and counting. The apples were still rejects. The process was still cold maceration and patience. The only difference was that nobody, not one single person who slowed down on the county road, was laughing anymore. The story of Sarah Kessler was never really about vinegar. It was about a way of looking at things that most people never bother to practice. For years, the orchard saw waste. The neighbors saw a nuisance. The juice conglomerate saw filler. Sarah looked at the same piles of bruised, softening fruit and saw inventory, a blank canvas, a future nobody else had the patience to ferment. Ruth, her grandmother, once told her that the fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. People decided that. Nature never did. Sarah spent 46 failed batches learning how right that was. Value doesn't vanish just because something looks broken or unwanted. It just becomes harder for most people to see. That is not a vinegar lesson. That is a life lesson hiding in a pile of rotten apples. Somewhere, right now, a truck is backing up to a loading dock and unloading something everyone else has already decided is worthless. Most people will drive past without a second look. Every once in a while, someone stops. Maybe that someone is you. If this story reminded you that the messiest looking chances are sometimes the best ones, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about something you once overlooked that turned out to matter. Share this with someone who needs a reminder today. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is the thing you almost threw away.